In a dusty Texas auction yard, a forgotten horse trainer hides in the shadows, carrying the weight of a tragedy that destroyed his life. But when a proud millionaire slaps a magnificent stallion as a joke, the horse's response stuns the crowd and awakens ghosts long buried. What unfolds is not just a battle over ownership, but a fight for truth, loyalty, and redemption that no amount of money can buy. The air over Amarillo carried that dry, sharp tang of dust and hay, the kind that clung to your throat and left a bitter reminder of summer. The auction grounds were alive with chatter, bootsteps on wood, the metallic clank of gates swinging open and shut. For most, this was just another Saturday at the Panhandle Stock Horse Auction, but for Eli Turner, standing half-hidden by the shadows of the holding pens, it felt like standing on the edge of a grave. He had sworn never to come back to a place like this. 2 decades had passed since anyone had last seen him inside an arena, since the days when his name meant something, when people whispered about the man who could hear a horse's soul. That was before the fire, before Willow, before silence swallowed him whole. Now he was just a man with weathered hands and boots scuffed down to the leather, working as a handler for a rancher who hardly remembered his name. Yet there he was, leaning against the rough boards, watching the crowd swarm toward the ring as if the entire town had gathered for a glimpse of royalty. The reason for the commotion stepped into the light, led by 2 handlers straining to keep him calm. Iron Creek. The stallion's presence was undeniable, like thunder trapped in muscle and bone. His coat shimmered a deep mahogany, each ripple of muscle beneath it alive with contained power. He didn't prance or rear. He walked with a measured confidence, as though the ground belonged to him. And when the sun cut across his flanks, the whole arena seemed to stop breathing. Eli's chest tightened. That look, those sharp, watchful eyes, black as a midnight storm, he knew them. He didn't know why, but a chill crept down his spine, as though the past had just brushed cold fingers against his shoulder. "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer boomed from his platform, voice slick with enthusiasm, "feast your eyes on the pride of the season, Iron Creek, son of champions bred for legacy, a stallion you'll tell your grandkids about." Applause swelled. Shouts of appraisal ricocheted through the rafters. Money filled the air like perfume, intoxicating, greedy. People leaned forward, hungry not just for the horse, but for the prestige that came with owning him. Eli stayed rooted in the shadows. He hadn't clapped, hadn't moved. But inside, something stirred. It was the same gnawing ache that had driven him away from the world all those years ago. The ache of remembering. A figure pushed his way through the crowd, drawing eyes the way a spark draws dry grass. Preston Hale, the man looked as though wealth dripped off him like oil. Crisp white shirt, tucked into dark jeans, boots polished to a mirror shine, a smile wide enough to cut. He was the kind of man who lived for an audience, for control, for the pleasure of reminding everyone in the room that nothing was out of his reach. "Fine animal," Preston said, loudly enough for everyone to hear, swaggering toward the horse. "But let's see if he's got some manners." The handlers stiffened. One of them murmured a protest, but Preston ignored it. He reached out with a theatrical flourish and smacked Iron Creek's neck with the flat of his palm. It wasn't hard enough to hurt, but the sound cracked through the arena like a gunshot. Conversations died. Laughter halted. Even the auctioneer stammered into silence. Eli froze where he stood. Every nerve in his body screamed as the memory of firelight and smoke flared in his mind. Iron Creek didn't rear, didn't shy away. Slowly, he turned his head. Those midnight eyes locked on Preston with a focus so sharp, so deliberate, it made the crowd shiver. There was no panic in that stare, no wild fear. Instead, it was steady, old, almost human. Preston laughed, though the sound rang hollow in the silence. "Tough guy, huh?" he muttered. He took a step back, but his grin wavered. The crowd leaned in, captivated. Something had shifted in the space between horse and man, invisible but undeniable, a tension older than the dust beneath their boots. And in that suspended moment, Eli Turner felt the past clawing its way back into the present. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. All he could see was the glint of recognition in Iron Creek's eyes, the echo of another pair he once knew, the fiery gaze of Willow on the night everything was lost. Eli pressed a hand to the railing, knuckles white. He didn't know what this meant, or why fate had brought him here. All he knew was that something was happening, something that would not let him walk away this time. The arena smelled of sweat, hay, and anticipation, that peculiar mixture found only in places where fortunes were exchanged over bloodlines and muscle. The air was thick with tension after Preston Hale's hand cracked against Iron Creek's neck. The sound still seemed to hang there, echoing across the rafters, echoing inside Eli Turner's chest as though someone had struck him instead. Every voice in the arena had died out at once. It was as if even the ceiling fans stopped their hum for a heartbeat. Boots scuffed nervously on the floor, the handler's grips on the stallion's reins tightened, and somewhere a camera shutter clicked, trying to capture what had just happened. But Iron Creek stood unmoving. He did not rear back or lash out, nor did he cower. He simply turned his head, a slow, deliberate motion, and his eyes locked onto Preston with an intensity that pinned the man in place. Those eyes, black, sharp, and filled with something ancient, did not blink. They did not waver. A ripple spread through the crowd. Whispered voices collided like restless wind. Some faces registered shock, others awe, and a few glanced toward Eli, though he remained hidden in the half-shadows by the pens. He was stiff, like a man bracing against a memory too heavy to carry. Preston shifted under that gaze. He tried to smirk, puffing out his chest, as though daring the animal to do more. "What's the matter? Never been disciplined before?" His voice rose in mockery, but it rang thin, and no one laughed with him. Instead, Iron Creek stepped forward. Just one step. Deliberate, heavy, measured. The sound of his hoof striking the packed dirt rang out louder than any applause. The stallion's head lowered slightly, his muscles taut beneath the mahogany coat that shimmered under the lights. He wasn't threatening. He was calculating. The crowd sensed it, something uncanny, like the horse was reading the man, weighing him. For Eli, the sight cut too deep. He had seen that look before. Long ago, in the eyes of Willow, on the night the storm came, when lightning split the sky and fear tore through the stables. He remembered the way she stood against the thunder, proud and unyielding, even as chaos swallowed the world around her. Now, standing in that arena, he felt time collapse into one unbearable moment. His throat tightened, his breath shallow. Martha Collins, the auction manager, stood frozen near the fence line. She had seen countless stallions brought into this arena, temperamental broncos, nervous colts, fiery mares, but never anything like this. The control, the stillness, the eerie intelligence radiating off Iron Creek made her chest tighten. She caught herself whispering, "He's holding back." Preston barked a laugh, desperate to break the silence. "Come on, folks, it's just a horse. Don't act like he's the president." But his voice faltered, and his eyes darted toward the handlers as if to confirm that the stallion was still restrained. No one responded. The audience's gaze had already shifted, drawn irresistibly toward Eli. They seemed to notice him for the first time. The weathered man in the shadows, his jaw clenched, hands curled tight at his sides. His presence, once invisible, now commanded silent attention. He didn't look at them. His eyes were locked on the stallion, as if tied by an invisible thread. Samuel Reed, the old veterinarian, leaned on the fence with arms crossed, studying both man and horse. He had known Eli back in the days when Willow made her mark on the circuit. He recognized that look, the one Eli was giving now. It wasn't just recognition. It was reckoning. He narrowed his eyes, feeling a knot form in his chest. The handlers tugged on Iron Creek's reins, coaxing him to move, to pose for the buyers. But the stallion remained still, gaze unbroken, hooves rooted to the ground. For those who had spent their lives around horses, the meaning was clear. This was no ordinary defiance. This was choice. Eli felt sweat trickle down his back. The memory of fire roared in his ears, wood crackling, rain pounding, a scream swallowed by the storm. 20 years of silence, of trying to bury the truth, suddenly surged to the surface. His vision blurred, but he forced himself to breathe, gripping the railing until the wood bit into his palm. Iron Creek blinked once. The spell seemed to loosen, but only slightly. The horse turned his head away from Preston, and for the briefest second, his gaze found Eli in the shadows. The crowd didn't notice. They were too focused on Preston's rattled bravado. But Eli felt the air leave his lungs. It was as though the stallion had seen straight through him, into the ashes of that night, into the hollows he had carried for half his life. The connection burned like recognition, and it shook him to his core. The auctioneer, clearing his throat, tried to bring the spectacle back under control. "Well, folks, let's move along, shall we? Opening bids for Iron Creek, the finest specimen you'll find this side of the Mississippi." His voice cracked, failing to mask the tremor of unease. But the arena wasn't the same anymore. The slap had done more than sting. It had shifted the ground, woken something in the stallion, and cracked open wounds buried in Eli's soul. The crowd knew it. They could feel it in the way the air hung heavy, in the way even Preston seemed smaller now, diminished under the silent weight of a horse's stare. Eli tore his eyes away, finally pulling back from the railing. He wanted to leave, to escape before the past swallowed him whole again. But his legs wouldn't move. Deep down, he knew it was already too late. The past wasn't coming for him. It was already here. The crowd began to stir again, murmurs returning to fill the silence left by Iron Creek's stare. The auctioneer tried to rally the room, his voice sharp and hurried, but the energy was different now. The slap had left a mark on more than the horse's hide. It lingered in the air, heavy and unspoken. People shifted in their seats, unsure of what they had just witnessed. Eli Turner remained pressed against the rough boards of the holding pen. His knuckles were white, his breathing shallow. He couldn't shake it. The way the stallion had turned, the way those eyes had found him in the shadows. Not Preston, not the handlers. Him. Eli. It was impossible. And yet it was undeniable. Those eyes dragged him backward through years, into a night he had spent half his life trying to bury. The storm had rolled in fast that evening, lightning cutting jagged scars across the Amarillo sky. Rain fell in sheets, drenching the pastures until the soil turned to black mud. Eli remembered running through the downpour, boots slamming against the ground, the thunder of hooves in panic. Willow had been the fire of his soul, a mare as fierce as she was beautiful, a chestnut blaze that seemed born from the storm itself. She had carried him to victories, made his name echo in arenas across Texas. People said Eli didn't just train her. He spoke to her, understood her in ways no one else could. That night, the barn door had been left open by mistake, or maybe it was fate. A flash of lightning, a clap of thunder, and chaos erupted. Horses screamed, hooves pounded, wood splintered. Eli had sprinted toward Willow's stall, his heart thundering louder than the storm. He could still see it in his mind, the way her eyes locked onto his in the dark, wild but trusting, even as smoke began to rise. And then the collapse, the flames swallowing her body, the sound of her final cry tearing through his chest like a blade. They told him later that the foal hadn't made it either, that the unborn promise of her bloodline died with her in the fire. Eli had believed them. He had no choice but to believe them. For 20 years, that was the story he lived with, the wound that never healed. And yet, staring now at Iron Creek, standing regal in the auction ring, Eli felt the scar split open. The stallion's gaze was not just piercing, it was familiar. It was Willow's. That same fire, that same unyielding spirit. Martha Collins noticed the change in Eli from across the arena. She had worked at the auction house long enough to recognize more than horses. She recognized grief. She remembered the night of the fire, too. She had been younger then, a junior handler, helping to drag half-mad horses into safety, while Eli fought like a man possessed to reach Willow. She had seen him after, kneeling in the rain beside the smoldering ruins, soaked and silent, broken. Now, seeing his shoulders tense, his eyes locked on the stallion, she knew something had cracked open again. Preston, oblivious to the storm inside Eli, strutted along the edge of the ring with his usual arrogance. He grinned at the murmuring crowd, eager to pull their attention back to himself. "Y'all are too jumpy," he barked. "It's just a horse. Fine one, sure, but he ain't the Messiah. Money's what matters here, and I've got plenty of it." He laughed, but it came out sharp, brittle. Even he seemed unsettled, though he'd never admit it. Samuel Reed had edged closer, too, leaning heavy on the fence, his weathered face shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. He had seen Iron Creek before the auction, examined the stallion's legs, his teeth, his gait. He remembered thinking there was something unusual about the way the horse carried himself. Calm, aware, too measured for a stud his age. Now, watching him fix his gaze first on Preston, then on Eli, Samuel's stomach turned with a suspicion he had not dared to voice. Eli forced himself to step back, to breathe. But memory surged, refusing to let go. He heard the crack of the burning beams again, felt the heat of the fire, the sting of smoke in his lungs. He heard his own scream as he called Willow's name, the desperate cries, swallowed by the storm. The ache in his chest was unbearable, as if time itself had folded, dragging him into that night once more. Iron Creek shifted in the ring, muscles rippling like coiled thunder. The handlers tugged nervously, but the stallion wasn't resisting. He was watching. Always watching. His head dipped slightly, almost imperceptibly, as though acknowledging something Eli himself had yet to accept. The crowd didn't know what to make of it, but Eli did. He didn't understand how or why, but deep in his gut he knew. There was a piece of willow standing in front of him. He clenched his fists, fighting against the rush of tears that threatened to surface. The past was clawing at him, and with it came a single, terrible question. Could the story he'd lived with for 20 years have been a lie? Could the foal have survived? His breath caught as Iron Creek's ears flicked forward, his eyes narrowing, as if answering a thought Eli hadn't spoken aloud. Around them, the auction continued, voices rising again with bids shouted across the arena, numbers tossed like weapons. But for Eli, the noise faded into nothing. It was just him and the horse, bound by an invisible thread of memory and recognition. And in the depths of those dark eyes, Eli felt the weight of everything he had lost, and the faint, dangerous flicker of hope he had long ago sworn he would never feel again. The tension in the auction hall lingered long after the bidding had resumed. Though voices rose and numbers were shouted, the energy was restless, unsettled, as if every person present had witnessed something they could not name, but could not ignore. Eli Turner remained at the edge of the pens, half hidden, his gaze never straying far from Iron Creek. Each flick of the stallion's ear, each shift of his weight, sent echoes through Eli's chest, stirring ghosts he thought he had buried forever. Preston Hale, however, thrived in the attention. He strutted back to the front, tipping his hat to the crowd as though he had orchestrated the silence himself. His grin stretched wide, showing white teeth against tanned skin, a man drunk on his own performance. "Don't get spooked," he called out, his voice booming against the rafters. "A stallion like that needs a firm hand. You let them forget who's boss, they'll walk all over you." Some chuckled nervously, eager to fall back into the rhythm of spectacle, but most remained quiet, their eyes flicking between Iron Creek and the man who claimed to command him. The stallion had resumed his still, deliberate stance, head slightly lowered, muscles coiled like springs. Every movement radiated power restrained, a storm waiting behind calm skies. Preston's display had unsettled him. Yes, but not in fear. Something else, something no one there quite understood. Preston didn't notice, or refused to. He waved at the auctioneer to continue, leaning close to whisper in his ear, loud enough for those nearby to catch a word or two, guaranteed, no limit, he's mine. Money wasn't a barrier for Preston. He bought what he wanted because it pleased him to do so. Horses, land, oil fields, even people's silence, everything had a price, and he enjoyed paying it, if only to remind others that he could. Eli's stomach knotted. He had known men like Preston before, swaggering, arrogant, blind to the soul of the animals they paraded. But there was something sharper in Preston's gaze, something vengeful. This wasn't just about owning a horse, this was about control. And Eli knew, in a way he couldn't yet put to words, that Iron Creek would not submit to being anyone's ornament. Martha Collins circled the edge of the crowd, her sharp eyes missing nothing. She saw the discomfort ripple through the buyers, the way hands that once twitched eagerly toward bidding cards now hesitated. Wealthy men and women exchanged whispers, some shaking their heads, others glancing at Preston with unease. Martha had worked this circuit long enough to know when a reputation was faltering. Preston's slap, meant as a show of dominance, had instead planted seeds of doubt. Samuel Reed leaned against the rail near Eli, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. The old vet had seen more horses than most men had seen sunrises, and he knew when something didn't add up. Iron Creek wasn't behaving like a young stud bred only for show. His reactions were too precise, too restrained. Samuel's gaze drifted to Eli, noting the way his hands trembled slightly at his sides. He remembered the fire, too, though he had never spoken of what he found in the aftermath. That night had left scars on all of them, visible and invisible alike. Preston's voice carried again, cutting through the murmurs. "I'll take him," he declared, as though the auction were already finished, as though his word were law. "Doesn't matter the cost. A horse like that belongs in front of the cameras, not rotting in some pasture. My ranch will make him a star." The arrogance in his tone twisted something in Eli's chest. A star. That wasn't what Willow had been. That wasn't what this horse should be. Horses weren't trophies, weren't possessions to be flaunted. They were lives, spirits, connections forged in sweat and trust. Eli wanted to shout it, to tear down Preston's smug grin with the truth, but the words stuck like thorns in his throat. Too many years of silence. Too many years of running. Iron Creek shifted again, the light catching his coat in a blaze of red-brown. His gaze swept the crowd, but returned inevitably to Eli. For the second time, Eli felt pinned, exposed beneath those dark eyes. His heart slammed in his chest, each beat a reminder of the night he lost everything. He could almost smell the smoke again, feel the sting of rain mixing with tears on his face as he knelt by the ashes. The handlers tugged nervously, sensing the stallion's focus. "Easy, boy," whispered, though his voice shook. Iron Creek flicked an ear, but didn't move, his attention fixed elsewhere. Martha caught the exchange, her breath catching. She remembered Eli's story, though most had let it fade into rumor. To see him here, in this moment, staring down a horse that looked back with uncanny recognition, it was as if the past had walked straight into the present. She whispered under her breath, "Dear God, not again." Preston noticed none of it. He stood taller, puffed with victory already. "Bring the papers," he barked, snapping his fingers toward the auction staff. "Let's make this official." His grin widened, blind to the shifting tide of the crowd around him. Eli turned away, pressing his palms against the rough wood of the rail, fighting to steady his breath. He didn't want to be seen, didn't want to be dragged back into the world that had broken him. And yet something deep inside told him he couldn't walk away. Not this time. Not with that stallion standing there like a living shadow of everything he had lost. Samuel's voice, low and steady, broke through his thoughts. "You see it too, don't you?" Eli didn't answer, but his silence spoke louder than words. The bidding resumed, Preston's name called out, his price unmatched. But the murmurs didn't stop. Something had shifted in that arena, something bigger than money, bigger than Preston Hale's swagger. And Eli Turner knew, as he stared back toward Iron Creek, that his life had just stepped out of the ashes and into the light, whether he was ready or not. The Amarillo sun was beginning its slow descent, the light slanting golden through the high windows of the auction barn, yet the room still buzzed with unsettled energy. Preston Hale's booming laughter and bold declarations filled the space, but beneath them, murmurs drifted like an undercurrent, buyers whispering to one another, handlers muttering about what they'd seen. Iron Creek stood quietly in his pen, every muscle taut with restrained power, his ears twitching at the sounds, but his eyes fixed somewhere else, somewhere only he seemed to understand. Martha Collins slipped away from the commotion, her sharp eyes scanning the tack room where the horse files were kept. As the manager of the auction, she had handled hundreds of registrations over the years, and she prided herself on knowing the details of each animal that passed through her hands. But something about Iron Creek's papers had nagged at her since the first time she'd seen them. Too neat, too clean, as if someone had scrubbed the story of his bloodline until there was nothing left but empty names and blank spaces. She pulled the thin folder from the drawer, her hands trembling slightly. The official documents listed a sire from a well-known Oklahoma stud farm, but there was no dam listed, no breeding record, no dates that lined up with the usual protocols. Horses of this caliber had lineages that were cataloged meticulously, each birth registered, each mare documented. This one read like a ghost. Martha frowned, flipping through the pages again and again, her lips pressing tighter with each pass. It was a puzzle where all the edge pieces were missing. Samuel Reed found her there, hunched over the papers, a crease between her brows. The old veterinarian's boots scuffed against the wooden floor as he entered, leaning heavy on his cane. "Found something?" he asked, though his voice carried the tone of a man who already suspected the answer. Martha lifted her head, her eyes shadowed. "These records don't make sense. It's like someone built a bloodline out of smoke. No dam listed, no foaling record. Just gaps." She handed the folder to him. Samuel took it, his rough fingers tracing the lines of type, his jaw tightening. "I've seen this before," he said after a long silence. "Back when folks wanted to hide where a horse came from. Private deals, unrecorded births. Sometimes it's about money, sometimes pride, and sometimes—" He trailed off, his gaze flicking toward the arena where Iron Creek stood. "Sometimes it's about something else entirely." Eli Turner lingered by the open door, drawn by the sound of their voices. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the mention of hidden bloodlines stopped him cold. His hand rested against the frame, rough palm pressed hard, as if the wood might hold him upright. "What are you saying?" His voice was quiet, strained, but it carried enough weight to draw both Martha and Samuel's eyes. Samuel studied him for a long moment before answering. "I'm saying this horse didn't just appear. Someone wanted him hidden, and someone wanted him here." Eli's gaze shifted back to the stallion, his breath catching as he noticed something he hadn't before. Along Iron Creek's left hind leg, just above the fetlock, a faint scar curved like a crescent. It was small, nearly invisible beneath the sheen of the stallion's coat, but Eli knew it instantly. His heart stumbled. He had seen that mark before, on the foal that had stumbled from Willow's stall the night of the fire, wild-eyed and trembling. Eli had reached for him in the storm, rain slick on his palms, only to lose him in the chaos. They had told him the foal never survived, that the smoke and the flames had taken him before dawn. He had believed them because it was easier than believing the alternative, that he had failed both mother and child. Now, staring at that faint scar, the ground shifted beneath him. Memories surged, unbidden. The heat of the flames, the sound of cracking timbers, Willow's frantic eyes locked on his until the end, and behind it all, the faint, desperate cry of a foal, swallowed by storm and fire. His chest tightened until he thought it might crush him. Could it be? Could Iron Creek be more than just a horse with a powerful stance and strange eyes? Could he be the living proof that the past had not died in those flames? Martha saw the change in Eli's face, the way his jaw clenched and his eyes glistened. She wanted to ask, but the weight in the air warned her to wait. Samuel, however, followed Eli's gaze and saw the scar. His lips pressed into a grim line, his suspicions now rooted in something more than guesswork. In the ring, Preston Hale laughed again, loud and brash, his words echoing through the rafters. "That horse is mine, folks. He'll look fine on my ranch, front page of every magazine you can think of. Maybe I'll parade him down Main Street just to remind y'all who's king around here." The crowd gave him only tepid chuckles, their eyes darting uneasily toward Iron Creek, then back to the papers Martha still clutched. Eli turned slowly away from the stallion, his mind spinning. 20 years of silence, of self-imposed exile, of believing the past had been buried with Willow's ashes. Suddenly, none of it felt true. The papers were wrong. The scar was real, and the stallion's eyes, steady and unyielding, seemed to whisper a truth Eli wasn't ready to face. Martha closed the folder with a snap, her voice low but firm. "This horse carries a history, Eli. Maybe yours. Maybe more. But one thing's certain. It's not the history Preston Hale thinks he bought." The words hung heavy in the tack room, echoing louder than Preston's bravado out in the arena. For the first time in 2 decades, Eli felt the faint, terrifying spark of hope. And with it came fear. Fear that the truth, once unearthed, might undo him all over again. The barn was quieter than the arena, the sounds of bidding and chatter muffled by thick wooden walls, and the smell of hay, leather, and horse sweat. Eli Turner lingered near Iron Creek's stall long after most of the buyers had drifted toward the food stands outside. His boots pressed into the packed earth, his hat low over his eyes, but his stillness carried a tension so heavy it seemed to thrum in the air. The stallion stood just beyond the bars, breathing slow and steady, his breath fogging the slats of light spilling through the cracks in the boards. Eli had told himself he wouldn't get close, that he would keep his distance. Yet here he was, pulled forward as though the horse had lassoed him with nothing but his gaze. He reached out, hesitant, his calloused hand hovering inches from the iron bars. For a moment he froze, unsure if he could bear what he might feel. But then Iron Creek moved. The stallion shifted one heavy step closer and lowered his head until the warmth of his muzzle brushed against Eli's knuckles. The touch was light, but it jolted through him like lightning. Eli closed his eyes, breath catching in his throat, and memory swelled around him. Willow, pressing her nose into his chest after a long day of training. Willow, pawing at the earth impatiently before a race. Willow, staring at him in the fire, her eyes fierce even in the face of death. Now, in this barn, the same energy poured from Iron Creek's quiet, deliberate gesture. "You know me," Eli whispered, before he realized the words had left his mouth. His voice was ragged, more prayer than statement. Iron Creek's ears flicked, his dark eyes steady, and for a heartbeat Eli swore the stallion understood. Martha Collins appeared at the end of the aisle, her arms full of stray tack she had been gathering. She slowed when she saw them, her chest tightening at the sight. The man who had disappeared into the hills 2 decades ago was now standing close enough to touch the very thing that had broken him. She stepped lightly, not wanting to disturb the fragile moment, but her breath escaped in a hushed whisper. "Lord, he's holding back." Samuel Reed joined her, leaning heavy on his cane, his eyes narrowed with the sharpness of someone measuring not just the animal, but the man before him. He had seen hundreds of trainers lose themselves in grief, but Eli's collapse had been different. It wasn't just the loss of a horse, it had been the loss of purpose, of identity. And now, standing in front of Iron Creek, Eli looked like a man teetering on the edge of rediscovering both. The stallion huffed softly, shifting his weight but not breaking contact. His nostrils flared, his breath hot against Eli's skin, and the faintest tremor passed through the man's hand. Eli swallowed hard, his throat working against the tide of emotion that rose up, unrelenting. Martha spoke gently, her voice carrying across the aisle. "He isn't like the others, Eli. You feel it too." She said it not as a question, but as a fact, her eyes darting between the scar on Iron Creek's leg and the look on Eli's face. Eli didn't answer. His jaw tightened, his lips pressed into a thin line. The silence between him and the horse was louder than words. Iron Creek stepped forward again, his forehead brushing against the bars, pressing lightly as if asking Eli to close the distance. And Eli, against every instinct of self-preservation he had built for 20 years, leaned in. The warmth of the stallion's presence filled him, easing the cold ache he had carried since the night of the fire. From outside, Preston Hale's laughter echoed through the barn walls, brash and overconfident, cutting through the fragile moment like a blade. "He'll fetch a fine price," Preston boasted to anyone who would listen. "By tomorrow, Iron Creek will be mine, and he'll know who owns him." His words dripped arrogance, but they carried the sharp edge of a man who needed control more than admiration. Eli flinched at the sound, pulling back slightly, but Iron Creek held his ground. The stallion's ears twitched toward the noise, then flattened briefly before he returned his gaze to Eli. That steady, knowing look told more than any record or pedigree could. Eli saw defiance in it, not the wild rebellion of an untamed colt, but the calm rejection of a spirit too strong to be bent by arrogance. Samuel cleared his throat, his voice low. "A horse like him doesn't just obey papers and signatures. He chooses." The weight of his words settled over them, undeniable and dangerous. Martha nodded, her eyes flicking toward Eli. "And it looks to me like he's already made his choice." Eli's heart thudded painfully in his chest. He wanted to deny it, to push away the hope that threatened to unravel the life he had built out of silence. But the truth pressed against his palm, breathed against his skin, stared at him with eyes too familiar to ignore. He closed his hand slowly, gently brushing Iron Creek's muzzle, and in that fleeting contact he felt it. The bond he thought had died 20 years ago had been reborn. The sound of footsteps thundered down the aisle, pulling them back into the present. A handler hurried past, glancing nervously at the trio before disappearing into the tack room. The world hadn't stopped, no matter how much it felt like it should have. Preston's voice roared again from outside, demanding signatures, demanding attention. Martha's lips thinned as she looked at Eli. "This won't end here. He'll fight for that horse like he fights for everything else. Loud, dirty, and with money. You'd better be ready." Eli didn't respond. He kept his eyes on Iron Creek, the stallion's steady gaze anchoring him in place. For the first time in decades, he felt the stirring of something other than grief. It terrified him as much as it steadied him. Hope. Iron Creek snorted softly, his breath warm and damp against Eli's hand, and the world seemed to fall silent around them once more. The night stretched long over Amarillo, the neon lights outside the auction barn humming faintly, while voices inside still buzzed with speculation. The slap had become more than an ugly moment. It was a story already spreading across the grounds, whispered with unease, carried by every buyer who had seen the way Iron Creek looked back at Preston Hale. And yet Preston, drunk on his own bravado, saw none of it. He paced the manager's office like a restless bull, his polished boots striking the floor in sharp, arrogant rhythm. "Sign the papers," he barked, slapping a hand against the counter where the auction staff shuffled uneasily. "You all know who I am. I don't wait, and I don't haggle. This horse is mine." His voice rose until it rattled the glass panes in the door. "Tomorrow he'll be standing on my land, a hale stallion. And you'd better believe the world will see him." Martha Collins lingered near the doorway, her lips pressed into a thin line. She had seen Preston's type before. Men who believed money gave them the right to own anything that caught their eye. But this was different. The way he had hit Iron Creek, the way the stallion had answered him with silence and defiance, it wasn't just arrogance anymore. It was a threat, a promise of how the horse would be treated. Martha's gut told her Iron Creek would be broken, not trained, and she refused to let that thought rest. Out in the barn, Eli Turner stayed near the stall, his hat shadowing his face. The handlers had already turned in, leaving the aisles quiet except for the restless shifting of horses. Iron Creek stood calm, but his eyes followed every sound, ears flicking toward the office where Preston's voice thundered. Eli could feel it too, the storm of greed gathering outside these walls. He reached through the bars, his hand brushing against the stallion's neck, and whispered under his breath, "I won't let him take you. Not like this." Samuel Reed entered the barn quietly, his cane tapping against the ground, his gaze sharp even in the dim light. He stopped beside Eli, watching the way Iron Creek leaned into his touch, calm and steady. "That horse has made his choice," Samuel murmured. "But choice won't matter much when papers and lawyers get involved. Preston's not the kind of man to back down. He'll make it ugly." Eli didn't look up, his voice low. "Then maybe it's time someone stood in his way." Samuel studied him for a long moment, the weight of old memories in his eyes. He thought of Willow, of that night when rain and fire had mixed in the air, when Eli had lost everything, and Samuel had turned his back on a truth too heavy to carry. He had watched Eli fade into silence after that, a man hollowed out by guilt. Now, with Iron Creek before him, Samuel saw a spark of the old fire returning. Preston's laughter rang out again from the office, sharp and mocking. He had gathered 2 of his lawyers by now, men in blazers too clean for the dust of Amarillo. They spread papers across the counter, their pens scratching like knives carving into wood. "By morning," Preston crowed, "this stallion's future will be stamped with my name. Doesn't matter who thinks otherwise." Martha slipped into the barn, her footsteps quick, her face tight with urgency. She carried the folder of Iron Creek's records pressed against her chest, her knuckles white. "He's moving fast," she said, her voice hushed, but sharp. "If those papers go through, Iron Creek will be his before anyone can raise a hand to stop it. And once he's on Preston's land, no one will see him again." Eli turned, his gaze hard. "Then we need something stronger than his money. Something the board can't ignore." Samuel's eyes narrowed. "Proof. Real proof of who this horse is. Where he came from." Martha nodded quickly. "The papers are wrong. Too clean, too many gaps. But gaps alone won't stop Preston. We need blood, lineage, something undeniable." Silence stretched, filled only by the slow, steady sound of Iron Creek breathing. Then Samuel spoke, his voice gravel low. "I've still got it. A sample. From Willow. Took it years ago, before the fire. Never told anyone." Eli's head snapped toward him, his eyes blazing. "You kept that?" His voice was sharp, almost angry, but beneath it was something else, hope clawing its way through disbelief. Samuel nodded once, heavy and solemn. "Locked it away. Thought it might matter someday. Guess that day's here? Martha's breath caught, her fingers tightening around the folder. If we can test it against Iron Creek, then we'll know, Eli finished, his voice quiet but trembling with weight. He turned back to the stallion, his hand resting against the strong curve of Iron Creek's neck. The horse shifted closer, his warmth seeping into Eli's bones. For the first time in 20 years, Eli felt not just the ache of loss, but the pulse of possibility. Outside, Preston's voice rose in triumph, sealing his scheme with the ink of greed. Inside the barn, in the dim light and silence, another plan began to take shape. A plan born not of money or arrogance, but of truth. And Eli knew, deep in his chest, that the battle for Iron Creek had only just begun. The morning broke gray over Amarillo, clouds hanging low as if the sky itself carried the weight of secrets. The auction grounds were quieter than the night before, but unease still lingered in the air. Buyers drifted around the pens with their coffee, voices low, stealing glances at Iron Creek whenever they thought no one was watching. The stallion had become more than an animal overnight. He had become a symbol of something unspoken, a mystery that hummed beneath every conversation. Eli Turner had not slept. He sat on an overturned bucket outside Iron Creek's stall, his elbows resting on his knees, his eyes red-rimmed but sharp. He had kept watch through the night, listening to the horse shift and breathe, each sound echoing against the hollow places inside him. He couldn't shake the way Iron Creek had leaned into him, the way the stallion's gaze had reached places no human word ever could. It was too much like Willow, too much like the life he had lost in the fire. Martha Collins arrived with her usual brisk step, though her face was drawn with fatigue. She carried a thermos of coffee, which she set down beside Eli without a word. He nodded his thanks, though his hands never left the bars of the stall. She followed his gaze and felt her chest tighten. Iron Creek stood calm, his massive body relaxed, but his eyes alert, ears swiveling toward Eli as if waiting for his next breath. Samuel Reed appeared not long after, his old truck rattling into the lot. He walked slower these days, his cane biting into the dirt, but his presence carried a gravity that quieted the space around him. In his hand, wrapped in a faded cloth, he held a small metal case. He placed it gently on the tack room table and exhaled heavily, as though setting down more than just weight. "This is it," Samuel said, his voice gravel deep. "Blood sample from Willow. Took it before the fire, back when she was at her prime. I don't know why I kept it all these years. Maybe I knew something like this would come." Eli turned to him, his face caught between disbelief and raw emotion. "You kept a piece of her," he whispered. His throat tightened, and for a moment he looked as though he might break. Samuel nodded solemnly, his eyes heavy with things left unsaid. Martha opened the case carefully, revealing a small vial, its label faded but still legible. Inside, the blood had darkened with age, yet it represented more than science. It was memory captured, proof of a life that still pulsed through Eli's veins every time he remembered Willow's gallop, her fierce eyes, her wild spirit. "We'll need a fresh sample from Iron Creek," Samuel said, pulling a small kit from his bag. His hands, though aged, moved with the steady precision of a man who had done this countless times. "Hair, blood, doesn't matter. The lab can run it against Willow's." Eli stepped into the stall slowly, his movements measured, careful not to startle the stallion. But Iron Creek didn't shy away. Instead, he lowered his head, as if inviting Eli closer. The trust in the gesture stole Eli's breath. He stroked the stallion's neck, murmuring softly, and when Samuel approached with the kit, Iron Creek stood still, calm as stone. A few strands of hair were clipped, a small sample of blood drawn. The horse didn't flinch. The three of them stood in silence as Samuel sealed the samples and placed them carefully into a padded envelope. It was more than a simple act. It felt like sealing a question that had haunted 20 years of Eli's life. The possibility that this stallion was not just a horse, but a legacy reborn, pressed down on them with a force stronger than the storm clouds above. Martha crossed her arms, her voice low. "We'll send it express. There's a lab in Dallas that handles equine genetics. They'll have results within the week." Eli stared at the envelope as though it contained his soul. His chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. "A week," he muttered. It sounded both too short and unbearably long. Samuel placed a hand on his shoulder, his touch firm. "The truth's coming, Eli. Whatever it is, you'll finally know." Before Eli could answer, Preston Hale strode into the barn, his presence loud and invasive. He wore a fresh suit despite the dust, his boots gleaming, his smile sharp. Two of his lawyers trailed behind him, clipboards in hand. Preston's eyes swept the stall and landed on Eli with mocking delight. "Well, look who decided to crawl out of the shadows," Preston drawled. "Funny seeing you here, Turner. Thought you gave up on horses after that little tragedy of yours." His grin widened. Cruel. "Guess some ghosts never quit haunting." Eli stiffened, his jaw tight, but Iron Creek shifted closer to him. A wall of muscle and presence between man and millionaire. Preston chuckled at the sight. "Don't go getting attached. Papers are nearly finished. By the end of the day, he's mine. You can watch him shine on my ranch from whatever hole you call home." Martha stepped forward, her voice steady. "Auction rules don't give you ownership until registration is verified. And this horse's paperwork has gaps, serious ones." Preston waved a dismissive hand, sneering. "Paperwork's just ink. Money talks louder, and I've got more than enough of it." Samuel's eyes narrowed, his voice cold. "Money can't buy blood." Preston laughed, though unease flickered briefly in his eyes. "We'll see about that." He turned sharply, striding back out of the barn, his lawyers following like shadows. Silence returned, heavy and suffocating. Eli leaned against the stall, his hand resting on Iron Creek's strong neck. The horse pressed back gently, steady, grounding him. For the first time in 2 decades, Eli let himself feel it fully. Not just grief, not just guilt, but the fragile thread of hope. The truth was coming, carried in the envelope that would soon be on its way to Dallas. And when it arrived, everything would change. The clouds that had been gathering over Amarillo all day finally broke after sundown. Thunder rolled low across the plains, and sheets of rain slanted through the air, drumming against the tin roof of the auction barn. The smell of wet earth and lightning seeped inside. And for Eli Turner, the storm was no longer just weather. It was memory clawing its way back into the present. He sat on a wooden crate outside Iron Creek's stall, his elbows braced against his knees, his eyes fixed on the horse in the dim lantern light. Each rumble of thunder seemed to echo that night 20 years ago, when fire and storm had converged to tear his world apart. The memory was merciless. Willow's cry, the collapse of burning beams, the rain-soaked soil turning black beneath his knees. He had replayed it endlessly, torturing himself with the belief that if he had run faster, shouted louder, fought harder, He might have saved her. The guilt had become a second skin, one he could never shed. Now, as the barn trembled with the weight of the storm, Iron Creek stepped forward, his hooves striking the straw with calm deliberation. He lowered his head, pressing his muzzle softly against Eli's shoulder. The touch was warm, steady, grounding. Eli closed his eyes, the dam inside him threatening to burst. He hadn't cried in years, hadn't allowed himself that weakness. But with Iron Creek leaning against him, the tears came unbidden, sliding hot down his weathered cheeks. "You feel it too," Eli whispered hoarsely, his voice cracking against the roar of thunder. "Don't you? You know." His hand trembled as he brushed the stallion's neck, the mahogany coat slick with sweat, and rain dampness carried on the air. Iron Creek's eyes, deep and unyielding, reflected the lantern light like embers burning steady in the dark. Martha Collins entered quietly, her coat pulled tight against the rain. She paused at turn. The sight of Eli, shoulders hunched, the stallion pressed close to him. It was a picture she had never thought she'd see again. The broken trainer, and the kind of horse that could remind him who he once was. Her throat tightened, but she said nothing, letting the silence hold its weight. Samuel Reed arrived not long after, his hat dripping with rain. He leaned heavily on his cane, watching from a distance. He knew storms like this could reopen wounds deeper than flesh. He had carried his own share of ghosts, but Eli's had been heavier than most. Samuel saw it now, the way Eli's body sagged beneath the burden of remembering. The way Iron Creek seemed to bear part of that weight simply by standing near. The storm raged, lightning slicing the sky open, thunder shaking the ground. The horses in other stalls shifted nervously, some pawing, some snorting, but Iron Creek remained steady, his presence like a pillar in the chaos. Each time thunder cracked, his ears flicked, but his body stayed calm, as though he had known storms before and understood their language. Eli's thoughts unraveled with every roll of thunder. He remembered the night of the fire more vividly than he had in years. He remembered the frantic scramble to open gates, the acrid smoke that clawed his lungs, the orange glow that painted Willow's mane like molten copper. He remembered the flash of a foal stumbling in the dark, its thin legs slick with rain, a cry so faint he thought he'd imagined it. Then the collapse of the roof, the heat forcing him back, the moment when hope died in the smoke. But now, staring at Iron Creek, that memory refused to end where it always had. For the first time, it lingered. On the possibility that the foal hadn't perished, that somehow he had slipped free into the night. Eli gripped the bars of the stall, his breath shuddering. The scar on Iron Creek's leg was proof enough to tear his certainty apart. Martha approached slowly, placing a steadying hand on Eli's arm. "He's not just another stallion," she said softly, her eyes never leaving Iron Creek. "Whatever Preston thinks he's buying, it isn't the truth. There's more here, Eli. You know it." Eli swallowed hard, unable to answer. His chest heaved with the storm of emotion inside him. The guilt, the grief, the fragile bloom of hope, all of it warred within him until he thought he might collapse. Samuel finally stepped forward, his voice low and firm, cutting through the thunder. "I saw that foal the night of the fire, not clearly, but I heard him. Crying, coughing. I never told you, Eli. I didn't want to give you hope if it wasn't real. But now," he gestured toward Iron Creek, "now I can't ignore it. Neither can you." Eli turned slowly, his eyes burning with unshed tears, his voice barely audible. And if it's true, if he's hers, then I've spent 20 years living a lie. Iron Creek shifted again, his head lowering until his forehead pressed against Eli's chest. The weight of the gesture nearly undid him. Eli clutched the stallion's mane, his body trembling as though holding on to something too big to bear. Outside, the storm roared, rain hammering the roof like fists, but inside the stall, a different silence took hold. A silence thick with recognition, with the unspoken bond of man and beast. The hours dragged, the storm refusing to relent. Martha dozed in a chair, Samuel sat with his cane across his lap, and Eli remained rooted to the stall, unwilling to move. Iron Creek never left his side. When dawn finally broke, pale light spilling across the soaked earth, Eli looked into the stallion's eyes and whispered words that had lived inside him for 2 decades. I thought I lost you. The storm had passed, but the reckoning it carried had only just begun. The days after the storm carried a strange stillness, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Mud clung to boots and wagon wheels around the auction grounds, and the sky remained heavy with clouds that threatened more rain but never delivered. Yet beneath that calm, tension rippled through every corner of Amarillo. Word had spread about Preston Hale's slap, about the stallion that had stared him down and chosen silence instead of fear. Buyers whispered in diners, ranch hands talked in hushed tones while stacking hay, and through it all, Eli Turner moved like a man caught between the past and the edge of something he could not yet name. Iron Creek stayed close to him whenever he lingered by the stall. The stallion's presence was unyielding, steady as a heartbeat, his dark eyes watching Eli with an intelligence that unsettled him. Each time Eli met that gaze, he felt the weight of Willow's spirit pressing against the hollow places inside him. The memories, once unbearable, now came softer. Her gallop across open fields, the way she leaned into his hand, the fire in her eyes when storms rose. And now those same flames lived in Iron Creek. Undeniable. Martha Collins returned from town one afternoon carrying a thick envelope. Her boots splashed through the puddles as she strode across the yard, her jaw set. Samuel Reed followed slowly behind her, his cane biting into the mud, his face grim. Eli stood outside the stall, brushing Iron Creek's coat, when Martha approached and held the envelope out. It came, she said simply. Her voice was tight, as if she didn't trust it to hold steady. Eli stared at the envelope, his breath catching. His hand stilled against the brush, and Iron Creek shifted, sensing the change in him. Samuel leaned against the fence, his eyes on Eli. You've waited 20 years for this truth, he said. Don't run from it now. Eli's fingers trembled as he tore the seal. The paper inside rustled softly, a sound louder than thunder in his ears. He unfolded the report, his eyes scanning the lines, though his vision blurred with the weight of it. Then he found the words. Clear and undeniable. Positive match. Willow's bloodline confirmed. His chest tightened until he could barely breathe. The brush slipped from his hand, falling forgotten into the straw. He pressed the paper against his thigh, his jaw locking as a sob tried to break free. He had told himself not to hope, had buried it deep, but here it was in black and white. Iron Creek wasn't just any stallion. He was hers. He was Willow's. Martha reached out, her hand on his arm, steady and warm. "It's real, Eli," she said gently. "He's her legacy. He's yours." Eli closed his eyes, the dam breaking. Tears slipped free, hot against his weathered cheeks, and his shoulders shook with the release of 20 years of silence. Iron Creek lowered his head, pressing his muzzle into Eli's chest, the weight of his presence anchoring him. Eli clutched the stallion's mane, the sobs tearing through him raw and unrestrained. For the first time since the fire, he let himself grieve fully, not just for what he had lost, but for what had returned. Samuel turned his face away, his own eyes glistening. He had carried this secret too long, let it fester like a wound. Watching Eli break and mend in the same moment cut him deep, but it was the truth Eli deserved. The silence that followed was sacred, broken only by the slow rhythm of Iron Creek's breathing. When Eli finally lifted his head, his eyes were red but fierce with something new: resolve. He looked at Martha, then Samuel. "Preston can't have him. Not now. Not ever." Martha nodded, her jaw tight. "Then we'll fight. Papers, courts, whatever it takes. We have proof now." As if summoned by defiance, Preston Hale's voice rang out from the yard, loud and mocking. He strode across the mud in a tailored coat, his boots spotless despite the muck, his lawyers trailing behind like shadows. His smile was wide, but his eyes glittered with irritation. "Well, well," Preston drawled. "Looks like the old ghost found his tongue again. Don't matter what you think, Turner. The stallion's mine. I paid for him, signed the papers, and by law, he belongs to me." He slapped the side of the stall with a sharp crack that made other horses jump, though Iron Creek stood his ground. Eli stepped forward, the DNA report clenched in his fist. His voice was low but steady. "You didn't buy a trophy. You tried to buy a bloodline that isn't yours. This horse isn't just ink on a page. He's living proof, and you'll never own that." Preston's smile faltered, his jaw tightening. For the first time, he saw the weight of the storm gathering against him. Martha's fire, Samuel's silence, Eli's unyielding stare, and Iron Creek standing tall as though ready to defy him all over again. The yard fell quiet, eyes turning toward the confrontation. The storm had passed, but another was breaking, and everyone knew it. In Eli's hand, the paper shook not with fear, but with conviction. 20 years of loss had come full circle, and now the fight for Iron Creek was no longer about ownership. It was about redemption, about justice, about a bond that no amount of money could erase. Iron Creek shifted, stepping closer to Eli, his muzzle brushing the man's shoulder as thunder rumbled faintly in the distance. Eli laid a hand on the stallion's neck, steadying them both, and met Preston's glare head-on. For the first time, Eli didn't feel like the broken man who had fled into silence. He felt like the trainer he once was, the man Willow had made him, the man who understood that some legacies were carved in fire and blood and could never be bought. The morning after the DNA results were confirmed, the air around the auction grounds was sharper, colder, as if the whole town had caught wind of the storm about to break. Whispers followed Eli wherever he went, men tipping their hats respectfully now, women lowering their voices when they passed him. His name, once forgotten, was back on tongues again. Not because of his past failures, but because of Iron Creek. The stallion had become the center of a story no one could ignore, and in that story, Eli Turner was no longer just a ghost. But for Preston Hale, whispers cut deeper than knives. He had strutted into Amarillo to make a spectacle of power, and instead, he had become the subject of ridicule, Some mocked him behind his back. Others snickered outright when he passed. A millionaire slapped a horse, and the horse made him look small. It was humiliation that money couldn't buy off, and Preston's pride burned hotter than any fire. He sat in the office of his temporary ranch house outside town, a glass of bourbon sweating in his hand while two lawyers spread papers across the table. Their suits looked too clean for Texas, their voices precise and cold as they explained his options. "Ownership was transferred at the moment of purchase," one lawyer said, tapping a contract with a polished finger. "The DNA test complicates things, yes, but legally the stallion was auctioned under your name. The board has little choice but to honor that." Preston leaned back in his chair, his smirk returning, though his eyes gleamed with fury. "So Turner and his little friends think they've got a chance with a lab report? Let them try. This is America, gentlemen. Paperwork wins, not fairy tales about dead horses and miracles." He raised his glass in a mock toast. "By the time I'm done, that stallion will be grazing on my land and Turner will crawl back into the hills where he belongs." But Preston underestimated how much the crowd had already turned against him. Back at the auction grounds, buyers gathered in groups, murmuring about what they had seen. They spoke of the stallion's eyes, of the way he pressed against Eli's chest like a son returning home. It wasn't just spectacle anymore. It was a legend in the making. The story spread faster than contracts could be stamped. Inside the barn, Eli stood brushing Iron Creek's coat, his hand steady though his mind churned. The stallion leaned into the strokes, calm, as though he understood the fight building outside these walls. Martha paced nearby, her boots scuffing the dirt. "He's coming for him, Eli. Preston won't stop until Iron Creek is locked behind his fences." "I know," Eli said, his voice low, rough with fatigue but unyielding. "But he doesn't understand. This isn't about papers. It's about blood, about choice." His eyes flicked toward the stallion, whose ears twitched at his words. "And Iron Creek has already chosen." Samuel Reed entered, his face lined with worry. He carried a folded letter, word from the auction board. "They're calling a hearing," he said, handing it to Eli. "Preston's filed for possession. He claims you're interfering with his property." Martha swore under her breath. "That snake moves fast." Eli unfolded the letter slowly, his eyes scanning the lines. His jaw tightened as he read the date. 3 days. 3 days until the board would decide Iron Creek's fate. He folded the paper again, tucking it into his jacket. His hand lingered there, pressing against the weight of it as if it were pressing against his heart. "I won't let him take him," Eli said finally. The words came out steady, almost like a vow. That evening, the sun bled red across the horizon, casting long shadows over the pens. A crowd had gathered, drawn by rumor, by the sense that history was being written before their eyes. They watched from a distance as Eli led Iron Creek into the open yard, the stallion walking beside him without rope or halter, free yet unshakably loyal. Gasps rippled through the onlookers when Iron Creek stopped, pressed his head gently against Eli's shoulder, and stood there, calm and unforced. Preston arrived moments later in a black SUV, his lawyers stepping out like soldiers behind him. He strode into the yard, his papers raised like a weapon. "That horse is mine," he shouted, loud enough for everyone to hear. "By law, by contract, by money, whatever Turner thinks he has, it doesn't matter. He's mine." Eli turned slowly, his face lined with exhaustion, but his eyes burning with something fiercer than Preston's bluster. "You can wave your papers all you like," he said, his voice carrying clear across the yard. "But you can't buy loyalty, you can't buy blood, and you can't buy what this horse knows." At that, Iron Creek stepped forward, pressing his muzzle into Eli's chest again. The yard fell silent. Even Preston's lawyers shifted uncomfortably, their polished shoes scuffing against the dirt. In that silence, no paper in the world could outweigh what every soul there had just witnessed. Preston's smile faltered, rage flashing in his eyes. He pointed a trembling finger at Eli. "You'll regret this," he spat. "I'll bury you in lawsuits, drag you through courtrooms until you can't breathe. And when I'm done, that horse will still be mine." He turned sharply, storming back toward the SUV, his threats hanging heavy in the dusk. The crowd remained, watching Eli and Iron Creek stand together in the fading light. They saw something deeper than law or money, something sacred, unspoken. The whispers grew again, not of scandal this time, but of loyalty, of legacy, of a bond stronger than contracts. As the sun sank, Eli rested his forehead against Iron Creek's, his voice low enough only the stallion could hear. "Let him try. We've both faced worse storms, and this time I won't run." Iron Creek huffed softly, his breath warm against Eli's face, as if answering the vow. Together they stood, as night closed in, ready for the battle. Preston's pride had promised. The hearing day came heavy with heat, the kind that pressed down on the plains until the air shimmered like water above the dirt roads. The auction board had called for a gathering in the wide yard behind the barn, their long table set beneath a striped canvas awning that did little to soften the relentless sun. People poured in from every corner of Amarillo, not just ranchers and buyers, but townsfolk too, drawn by curiosity and the promise of a spectacle. They whispered as they gathered, trading stories of the slap, of the DNA results, of the quiet man who once was a legend, and the stallion who seemed to have stepped out of a ghost story. Eli Turner stood at the edge of the yard with Martha and Samuel beside him. He wore no suit, no polished boots, only the worn clothes of a man who had lived too many years in silence. His weathered hat shaded his eyes, but nothing could mask the tension in his jaw, the tremor of old wounds reopening. Beside him, Iron Creek shifted calmly, his ears flicking at the murmurs of the crowd. The stallion was not bound. No halter held him. He stood free at Eli's side, as though tethered by nothing but trust. Preston Hale arrived with noise and swagger, his black SUV rolling to a stop in a plume of dust. He stepped out in a spotless suit, his lawyers flanking him, their briefcases bulging with contracts. Preston's grin was wide, but his eyes were sharp, cutting over the crowd like knives. He relished attention, even if it was soaked in disdain. Raising the sheaf of papers high, he strutted toward the board's table. "This is the law," he declared, his voice booming. "This horse was auctioned under my name. I paid the price. Every contract, every registration, every stamp says he belongs to me. Turner is interfering with my property, and I demand it be corrected today." A low rumble of disapproval swept through the crowd, but Preston basked in it as though it were applause. He slammed the papers onto the table, the smack echoing beneath the awning. His lawyers nodded, voices ready to twist law into chains. Samuel Reed stepped forward, holding his cane like a staff, his voice gravel deep. "And what of blood, Preston? What of truth? This horse isn't just a line on a ledger. We have proof, DNA, lineage, the kind you can't buy with a pen or a stack of cash." He laid the sealed lab report before the board, his hand steady. The board members shifted, exchanging uneasy glances. They had lived long enough in Texas to know that horses were more than property, that some bonds couldn't be reduced to signatures. Still, they hesitated, their eyes flicking between the contracts and the DNA, between Preston's fury and Samuel's solemn weight. The crowd pressed closer, the heat of bodies thick in the air. Martha raised her voice, sharp and clear. "Look beyond the paper. Look at the horse. You all saw it. We all did. Iron Creek doesn't belong to Preston Hale. He never did. He's already chosen." At her words, silence fell. Every eye turned toward the stallion. Iron Creek lifted his head, nostrils flaring, the light catching his coat in a blaze of mahogany. He looked first at Preston, who sneered and reached out a hand as if to claim him. For a moment, the yard seemed to hold its breath. Then Iron Creek moved. Slowly, deliberately, he turned from Preston and walked across the yard, hooves striking the earth with measured rhythm. He crossed the space between arguments and papers, between past and present, until he reached Eli. There, before everyone, the stallion pressed his head into Eli's shoulder, his weight leaning into the man as though sealing a vow. The gasp from the crowd was like a wave breaking. Murmurs rippled, hands clutched hats, eyes widened. It was more than spectacle. It was a choice, undeniable and unforced, witnessed by all. Eli's chest tightened, his hand rising to rest against the stallion's neck. The warmth, the strength, the trust, he felt it surge through him, burning away 20 years of silence. He lifted his head and met Preston's glare. "You can buy contracts," Eli said, his voice carrying steady and strong. "But you can't buy loyalty. You can't buy a soul. This horse is not yours, and he never will be." Preston's face flushed red, his jaw working furiously. He snatched the papers from the table, waving them in the air. "This is the only truth that matters," he shouted. "Ink, law, money." His voice cracked as the crowd's murmur rose, drowning him out. The board president cleared his throat, his hand trembling slightly as he spoke. "We'll review both claims, but what we've seen today cannot be ignored." His gaze flicked to Iron Creek, still pressed against Eli. "This is not a matter we can decide in haste." Preston cursed under his breath, snapping at his lawyers to gather the papers. He stormed back toward the SUV, his threats loud enough for all to hear. "This isn't over, Turner. I'll see you in court, and I'll bury you in it." But no one was listening to him anymore. The crowd was fixed on Eli and Iron Creek, the man and stallion standing as one. In the hush that followed Preston's departure, people began to clap. Hesitant at first, then stronger, a tide of sound that rolled across the yard. It was not just for the horse, not just for the defiance. It was for a man who had once been broken, now standing whole again, with the past alive at his side. Eli lowered his forehead to Iron Creek's, whispering words only the stallion could hear. "Thank you." His voice cracked, but his spirit did not. The choice had been made, and it carried more power than any contract Preston Hale could ever wield. The dust had barely settled after the hearing when Samuel Reed lingered alone near the back of the barn, his weathered hands gripping the head of his cane as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. He had watched the stallion choose Eli in front of the crowd, had seen the hush fall when Iron Creek pressed his head against the man's shoulder. It should have been enough. But Samuel knew the truth was not finished yet. Too many years of silence pressed against his chest like stones, and he could no longer carry them. Eli was brushing Iron Creek in the stall when Samuel approached. The barn was quiet, lit only by lantern glow, the rest of Amarillo having turned in for the night. Martha had gone to speak with the auction board, leaving Eli and the stallion in rare solitude. Samuel cleared his throat, and Eli turned, his brow furrowing at the sight of the old vet standing stiff in the doorway. "You got something to say?" Eli murmured, not unkindly. Samuel shifted, his eyes lowering to the dirt. "More than I ever told you. More than I should have kept." He moved closer, each step deliberate, his cane striking the ground like a drumbeat. "About that night, the fire." Eli stiffened, the brush pausing in his hand. The word alone was enough to claw open the scars that never fully healed. Iron Creek shifted, sensing the change, his ears flicking. Eli steadied himself with a slow breath. "What about it?" The silence stretched until Samuel's voice cracked under its weight. "The foal. Willow's foal. He didn't die that night." His words hung heavy, louder than thunder. Eli's hand dropped the brush, the clatter echoing against the stall's wood. His eyes snapped to Samuel, wide with disbelief and rage. "What are you saying?" Samuel swallowed hard, his throat working against guilt that had lived too long. "After the fire, when the barn was still smoldering, I went back. I heard something, faint, a cough, a cry. The foal was alive. Burned some, weak but breathing. I pulled him from the wreckage." His hands shook as he gripped the cane tighter. "And I hid him." The words slammed into Eli like a hammer. His chest heaved, his face twisting as decades of grief collided with betrayal. "You hid him? You let me bury myself thinking they were both gone." Samuel's eyes glistened. "You were broken, Eli. I thought it would kill you if you knew he lived. We weren't speaking. Then. I was angry, bitter, jealous maybe of what you had with Willow. I told myself it was mercy, keeping him away. But the truth is, it was pride. Pride and fear." He shook his head, shame heavy in his voice. "I sent him away, to a contact in Oklahoma. Told them to hide the lineage, to keep him off the records. And that foal grew into the stallion standing in front of you now." Eli staggered back, his breath ragged. He pressed a hand to the stall rail, as though the wood were the only thing holding him upright. 20 years of mourning, of guilt, of silence, all of it twisted now into something sharper. Betrayal cut deep, but beneath it flickered something he couldn't yet name. Hope, fragile and furious. "You let me believe I failed her," Eli whispered, his voice raw. "You watched me drown in it. You watched me disappear into the hills, and you said nothing." Samuel's shoulders sagged, his old frame bent under the weight of his confession. "I was wrong. Every day since, I've known it. But I couldn't undo it. The more time passed, the harder it became. And now," he gestured toward Iron Creek, his eyes wet. "Now you see why I couldn't keep it any longer." Eli turned away, his chest heaving, his fists clenched. Iron Creek stepped forward, his breath brushing Eli's neck, grounding him in the moment. The stallion's quiet strength kept him from collapsing under the tide of anger and grief. He reached up slowly, resting a trembling hand against the horse's muzzle, clinging to the only piece of truth that mattered in that moment. The foal had lived. Willow's bloodline had survived. The silence between the men stretched, broken only by the horse's steady breathing. Finally, Eli turned back to Samuel, his eyes burning with fury and sorrow. "You took 20 years from me." "I know," Samuel whispered, his voice cracked under the weight of regret. "And I'll spend whatever years I have left trying to make it right. But don't let my sin steal this moment from you. He's here, Eli. He chose you. Don't waste what you've been given back." Martha re-entered then, halting at the charged air between them. Her eyes darted between Eli's clenched fists, Samuel's bowed head, and Iron Creek's steady presence. She said nothing, sensing words would shatter what little balance remained. Eli lowered his gaze, his voice rough as gravel. "This changes everything." Samuel nodded, tears slipping down his lined face. It always did. The barn fell into silence again, the lantern flickering shadows across the walls. Eli leaned against the stallion, his chest rising and falling with the weight of a truth too heavy to carry and too powerful to deny. For 20 years he had lived in the ashes of a lie. Now, with Samuel's confession, he stood on the edge of something else entirely. Not just grief, not just betrayal, but the chance for redemption he never thought would come. The town of Amarillo seemed to hold its breath in the days leading up to the board's final decision. Every diner, every feed store, every corner where ranchers gathered hummed with the same conversation. Iron Creek, Eli Turner, Preston Hale. It was no longer just about a horse. It was about pride, legacy, and the kind of truth that cut deeper than money. Eli had become the reluctant center of it all. Wherever he walked, heads turned. Some tipped their hats in respect. Others whispered with awe, remembering the young trainer who had once been a legend. Now he stood taller, though the weight of Samuel's confession still pressed heavy on his shoulders. Iron Creek followed him like a shadow, free yet loyal, his presence reminding Eli with every step that the past wasn't lost. It had been waiting. Preston Hale, on the other hand, grew louder, more desperate. He stormed through town in his spotless truck, lawyers at his side, barking orders into phones and making threats loud enough for everyone to hear. He painted Eli as a meddler, Samuel as a liar, and Martha as a schemer. But the more he shouted, the less people listened. Stories of the stallion's choice, of the way he had pressed his head into Eli's shoulder before the whole town, spread faster than Preston's contracts. In saloons and barbershops, men spoke not of paperwork, but of loyalty. The board set the hearing for a Saturday afternoon, and by noon the yard behind the auction barn was overflowing. Families brought chairs, children perched on fences, ranch hands leaned against posts, all drawn to witness what felt more like a trial of souls than a legal dispute. The board sat at their long table, faces solemn, while Preston's lawyers stacked contracts in neat piles, their polished pens ready to carve signatures into iron. Preston stepped forward first, his voice booming with false confidence. "This is America," he declared, holding up a sheaf of papers. "Property was property. I paid my money, I signed my name, and this stallion is mine. Whatever stories Turner and his friends spin, whatever fairy tales they tell about ghosts and bloodlines, none of it matters. The law is clear." The crowd murmured, some nodding reluctantly, others shaking their heads. Preston's smile widened, mistaking the noise for support. He slammed the papers down in front of the board, the sound sharp as a whip crack. Then Samuel rose, leaning heavy on his cane, his old frame trembling but his voice firm. "The law isn't the only truth," he said, his words carrying across the yard. "This horse carries bloodlines that matter. We have the proof." He laid the DNA results before the board, his hand steady despite his age. "You can't erase lineage with money. You can't bury history with contracts." Martha stepped forward next, her voice strong, her eyes sweeping over the crowd. "You all saw it. Every one of you. Iron Creek isn't Preston's. He chose. He walked across this yard and laid his head against Eli. Turner's chest. That's more binding than any piece of paper." A hush fell, the memory of that moment alive in the air. People shifted, their eyes moving to Eli, who stood at the edge of the yard with Iron Creek at his side. The stallion stood free, no rope, no halter, his head high and his body gleaming in the afternoon sun. He looked every bit the creature of legend, a living bridge between past and present. Eli stepped forward slowly, the crowd parting around him. His voice, when it came, was low, but carried with the weight of truth. I buried myself 20 years ago, believing I lost Willow and her foal. I carried that grief like a stone on my back. But here he stands. Iron Creek is hers. He's mine. Not because of contracts, not because of money, but because of blood, and because he chose. He placed a hand on the stallion's neck, steadying himself. And I'll spend the rest of my life protecting that choice. Preston sneered, his face red with fury. Dramatic words from a washed-up trainer, he spat. But drama doesn't win cases. Paper does. And I have the only papers that matter. The board members looked uneasy, caught between law and something far older. They whispered among themselves, their eyes flicking from Preston's contracts to the stallion standing calm at Eli's side. The silence grew heavy, every ear straining to hear their verdict. Then, as if sensing the weight of the moment, Iron Creek stepped forward. The stallion moved into the center of the yard, his hooves striking the dirt in slow, deliberate rhythm. The crowd held its breath as he turned, not toward Preston, who waited with an outstretched hand, but toward Eli. With regal certainty, Iron Creek lowered his head and pressed his muzzle against Eli's chest once more. The crowd erupted. Gasps, murmurs, then cheers filled the air. Hats flew into the sky, hands clapped, voices rose in unison. The choice had been made, clear and undeniable, not by contracts, but by the stallion himself. Preston's face twisted with rage, his lawyers scrambling to salvage dignity in the chaos. "This isn't binding," he shouted over the roar. "This means nothing. The board has to rule in my favor." But even as he raged, he saw the truth written on the faces around him. No matter what papers he waved, no one would stand behind him now. The board president finally rose, his voice firm though his hands shook. "We've heard enough. Ownership of Iron Creek cannot be decided on contracts alone. The evidence of bloodline and what we have all witnessed today is clear. The stallion's registration will be corrected. Preston Hale's claim is rescinded." The crowd erupted again, louder this time, their voices carrying like thunder across the plains. Eli closed his eyes, his hand gripping Iron Creek's mane, his chest heaving with relief and emotion. Martha wiped at her eyes, Samuel bowed his head, and Iron Creek stood proud, calm amid the storm of voices. Preston stormed toward his SUV, cursing and shouting, but the crowd barely noticed. His empire of money and arrogance had crumbled, undone not by men, but by the choice of a horse. And as he drove away in a cloud of dust, Eli stood in the yard, the stallion pressed close at his side, knowing the battle was over. Not won by whips, not by law, but by loyalty, by truth, by a bond that could never be bought. The days that followed the hearing unfolded with a quiet that felt almost sacred. For the first time in years, Eli Turner walked through Amarillo not as a shadow, but as a man whose name was spoken with respect once more. The story had spread beyond the auction grounds, beyond the town even, of a millionaire humbled, of a horse who chose his true master, of a legacy resurrected from ashes. Folks told it in diners over steaming coffee, in barns while pitching hay, in whispered awe around campfires. Iron Creek had become more than a stallion. He was living proof that truth outlives lies, that blood and loyalty are stronger than wealth. Preston Hale had vanished from the scene, his lawyers trailing him like vultures picking at scraps. His SUV was last seen barreling down the highway, dust trailing behind, his threats hollow echoes against the roar of the crowd that had turned its back on him. The town no longer spoke his name with fear, only with derision. For all his money and papers, he had been undone by something he could never control: a horse's choice and a man's quiet strength. Eli spent those days close to Iron Creek. He rose before dawn, as he had in the old days, brushing the stallion's coat until it gleamed in the first light. The work was slow, steady, grounding, and with each stroke of the brush he felt the weight of 2 decades lifting. Martha often joined him, her practical hands tending to tack and feed, her eyes softer now as she watched him reclaim the rhythm of his life. Samuel came too, leaning on his cane, his face lined not just with age but with regret slowly easing into relief. One morning, as the mist clung low over the fields, Eli led Iron Creek to a weathered trailer that hadn't rolled in years. The tires groaned, the rusted hinges protested, but it would serve. He hitched it to his truck, his movements deliberate, his heart thudding with purpose. Martha and Samuel stood waiting near the gate, silent witnesses as he loaded the stallion. Iron Creek stepped inside without hesitation, calm and steady, as though he knew where they were going. The drive was long and quiet, the back roads winding through open plains where the horizon stretched endless and golden. Eli kept one hand steady on the wheel, the other resting on the old gear shift, his eyes scanning the land that had once been his whole world. Memories rose with every mile, the thunder of Willow's hooves across these very fields, the warmth of her breath against his chest, the blaze of her mane in the sun. For years those memories had been knives. Now they felt like chapters of a story that had finally found its way back to him. When he reached the old Turner ranch, his chest tightened. The fences sagged, the pastures overgrown with tall grass, the barn a skeleton of what it had been. Yet the land breathed with memory, carrying the ghosts of what once was. Eli parked the truck and opened the trailer. Iron Creek stepped out slowly, nostrils flaring, ears pricked, his eyes scanning the expanse as if recognizing it. He trotted a few steps into the field, then broke into a canter, his muscles rippling, his mane whipping in the wind. Eli watched with a lump in his throat as the stallion moved across the land like a flame reborn. It was as if Willow herself ran beside him, her spirit alive in every stride. Martha stood quietly, tears slipping down her cheeks as she wiped them away with the back of her hand. Samuel rested a hand on Eli's shoulder, his voice low and hoarse. "She's here. You can feel it." Eli nodded, his eyes never leaving the stallion. "I can." His voice cracked, but there was no shame in it. Iron Creek slowed, then returned to Eli, stopping just inches from his chest. Eli stepped forward, pressing his forehead against the stallion's, closing his eyes as a flood of peace washed through him. His hands trembled as he whispered, "You found your way back. And so did I." For a long time they stood there, man and horse, bound not by reins or force, but by something far older. The crowd, the hearings, the contracts. None of it mattered now. What mattered was this moment, in the field where love had once been lost, and now was found again. As the sun climbed, its light turning the grass to gold, Eli felt whole for the first time in 2 decades. He wasn't the broken man who had walked away from the world. He was the trainer Willow had believed in, the man who understood that some bonds never die. They only wait. The circle had closed, not with endings, but with beginnings. And in that quiet field, under the rising sky, Eli Turner finally laid his ghosts to rest and stepped into life again. Hand in hand with the stallion who carried not just blood, but redemption. And now I want to hear from you. If you were there that day, would you have stood with the arrogant millionaire or with the horse who chose his true master? Drop a simple 0 if you stand with Preston, or 1 if you stand with Eli and Iron Creek. Don't forget to hit subscribe, because the next stories will take you even deeper into the unforgettable bonds between humans and animals.